Picture this, you're a Russian tank commander somewhere east of Robotine. It's early 2024. Your T-80 is dug into a tree line, you've got infantry behind you, drones overhead feeding coordinates back to your artillery. You've heard the British sent some tanks, 14 of them. 14! Russia has over 12,000 tanks in its inventory. You're not scared, you're almost insulted. Then your gunner tells you there's a contact at 5,300 meters. That's 5 kilometers. That's the distance from one side of Manhattan to the other. At that range, most tanks are a dot on a thermal screen. You squint, you guess, you hope. But the Challenger 2 crew on the other end of that shot wasn't guessing. They squeezed the trigger on a 120mm rifled gun that was designed from the ground up to put a round exactly where you're pointing it, at ranges where most tank commanders don't even bother loading. The round didn't miss. Now here's the part nobody's telling you straight. Those 14 tanks weren't a force. They were barely a platoon. And yet the story of what those 14 tanks actually did, and what the war did back to them, is one of the most honest case studies to come out of this conflict, because it doesn't flatter anyone. Stay with me, because what Russia feared about this tank was dead wrong, and what the West believed about it wasn't far behind. Let's establish the absurdity of the math first. Ukraine in early 2023 was fighting across a front line stretching roughly 1,500 kilometers. Russia had committed somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 troops to that front, with massed artillery, drone swarms, and armored columns backed by Soviet-era logistics infrastructure that, however creaking, had been built for exactly this kind of industrial-scale, grinding war. Britain sent 14 tanks. Not 1,400. 14. Britain announced the transfer in January 2023. Germany spent 3 months having a very serious meeting about whether to have another meeting. Poland just watched nervously. The Challenger 2 was going to Ukraine whether the alliance was ready or not. But here's what the headlines missed. 14 tanks with supporting vehicles, trained crews, and a British advisory presence adds up to a far more complex military package than the number suggests. The Challenger 2 doesn't just show up, it arrives with ammunition nobody else stocks, recovery vehicles nobody else operates, and maintenance knowledge that lives entirely inside the British Army. That was both its strength and, as Ukraine would discover, its biggest logistical headache. The phrase that keeps coming up from Ukrainian crews who operated the Challenger 2 is almost poetic in its simplicity, like a sniper rifle. That's not marketing. That's a T-64 veteran, someone who spent his career in Soviet doctrine armor, describing what it felt like to step into something built around a completely different philosophy. Britain never abandoned rifled barrel technology. The rest of NATO moved to smoothbore. Faster to manufacture, cheaper to maintain, easier to standardize across alliance ammunition supplies. Britain took the criticism, kept the L-30A1, and mostly ignored the complaints. Here's why that decision matters on the Eastern Front. Rifled barrels impart spin to the projectile. Spin stabilizes the round across longer distances in a way that smoothbore, fin-stabilized rounds don't fully replicate at extreme range. In a theoretical head-to-head engagement between a Challenger 2 and a T-90M at 2,000 meters, the difference in theoretical accuracy is modest. At 3,000 meters, the gap starts to open. At 5,300 meters, which is the distance of that reported kill on the Russian infantry fighting vehicle, you're in territory where most gun systems aren't even attempting aimed fire. The Challenger 2 attempted it, and according to the crew report, succeeded. Now I want to be careful here because that 5,300 meter claim is extraordinary, and extraordinary claims need scrutiny. It has been reported by multiple sources citing Ukrainian crew testimony, but there's no independently verified video of the shot. Hold that number with appropriate skepticism, while acknowledging what it implies even if it's directionally correct rather than precisely true. Even at 4,000 meters, that's a range where most tank commanders would already be reversing and calling it someone else's problem. The gun is only half the story. The other half is what the Challenger 2 looks like from the receiving end of a hit. Britain developed the Challenger 2's Dorchester armor, also known as Chobham Level 2, in the 1980s, and it remains classified in its exact composition. What is known publicly is that it's a composite array of ceramics, metals, and other materials layered in a way that absorbs and disperses kinetic energy rather than simply trying to resist it with sheer mass. The combination of Dorchester hull armor and a heavily armored turret creates a protection profile that, in the Gulf War, allowed Challenger 1s to survive multiple anti-tank missile hits that would have finished most other vehicles. In Ukraine in 2023, that heritage showed up in a single event that should have ended much worse. During fighting near Robotyne in late 2023, a Challenger 2 was struck and immobilized. The details are still partially murky. Different sources give different accounts of what hit it and how many times. What is consistent across reporting is this: the crew survived. They got out. In a war where tank crew survival rates after a catastrophic hit have been grim, Russians call the turret-off phenomenon the Jack in the Box. Though given what happens to the crew inside, it's not exactly a punchline. The Challenger 2's crew walking away from a combat kill is significant. The tank was lost, but the crew wasn't. That distinction matters in a way that doesn't show up in the simple "was the tank destroyed" scorecard. Ukraine is not running short of motivation or training pipelines for tank crews. It is, however, running extremely short of experienced tankers who have actual combat time. Every experienced crew that survives a hit is a resource the Army can rebuild around. The ones who don't survive take years of irreplaceable combat knowledge with them. That's not a statistic. That's a veteran who taught 10 other people how to stay alive, and now nobody in that unit knows what he knew. Russian T-72s store their ammunition in a carousel directly below the crew. When that cooks off, and in this war it cooks off constantly, the turret goes one way and the crew goes nowhere. The Challenger 2 keeps its ammunition in a separate bustle compartment behind blast doors. If it ignites, the doors blow outward. The tank dies, the crew doesn't. British engineers made that decision in the 1980s. Ukrainian tankers were alive in 2023 because of it. Here's where I'm going to tell you something that every hype video about Western tanks in Ukraine refuses to say plainly. The Challenger 2 is an extraordinary piece of engineering that was designed for a war that doesn't exist anymore. When Challenger 2 entered British service in 1994, the threat model was a NATO-Warsaw Pact confrontation in Central Europe. Ukraine in 2024 is the opposite of that scenario in almost every way that matters. The front line in the Zaporizhia region, where the Challenger 2s were primarily deployed, is not open steppe. It's minefields 4 to 8 kilometers deep, layered anti-tank ditches, drone corridors that light up any armored movement within minutes, and Russian FPV drones that cost $300 and can find a cracked engine cowling and push a shaped charge through it before a crew can react. The Challenger 2 weighs 75 tons. On soft Ukrainian soil in spring or after rain, that means ground pressure problems that restrict where it can even move. Roads that look fine on a satellite image will swallow it to the axles. Mobility is not this tank's virtue. Never was. The weight that makes the armor so effective also makes the tank sluggish, hard to extract when immobilized, and nearly impossible to maintain in a forward combat zone without equipment that only Britain brought and nobody else has. At one point in 2024, only around 7 of the original 14 were still combat ready, according to multiple military analysts and open source researchers tracking the fleet. Some of the missing were damaged by mines, some by drone strikes, some were simply sidelined waiting for spare parts that take a long time to source because the global Challenger 2 user base is, by definition, tiny. The Challenger 2 isn't failing because it's a bad tank. It's failing its readiness numbers because 14 of something can't sustain a war. That's a political problem wearing a logistics uniform. The FPV drone problem doesn't belong to the Challenger 2 specifically. It belongs to every armored vehicle on this front, and it's changed the math on everything. The modern battlefield in eastern Ukraine has a saturation density of drones that nobody planned for. Ukrainian and Russian operators are flying modified racing drones with shaped charges attached, and they're doing it in densities that turn any armored advance into something resembling a moving target gallery. Russia has been losing tanks not because Ukrainian anti-tank missiles are outclassing Russian armor. It's because a drone operator sitting in a barn 3 kilometers away can identify a tank, chase it down a road at 120 kilometers per hour, and push a shaped charge through the engine deck for the cost of a cheap vacation. The Challenger 2's Dorchester armor doesn't help much against a top attack FPV. All that composite protection faces forward and outward. A drone coming straight down through the engine deck doesn't care how thick your frontal armor is. Cage armor and bolt-on protection packages help at the margins, but the fundamental problem is that no amount of steel defeats a drone swarm if the drone operator has patience, good eyes, and a stable communications link. This is where Russia's greatest fear turned out to be completely wrong, and where Western confidence turned out to be wrong for completely different reasons. Because here's the thing, Russia never needed to penetrate the armor. Russia needed to stop the tank from doing anything useful. Mines, drones, and attritional fires did that more effectively than any ATGM. The tank Russia feared turned out to be stoppable, just not by anything Russia had prepared for. That distinction is gonna matter for every Western tank sent to every future conflict. Let me give you the actual ledger, because it's more interesting than the propaganda version from either side, and nobody's presenting it straight. The Challenger 2s operated primarily in the Zaporizhia sector, and later in the Kursk incursion area. In the Zaporizhia fighting, they were used correctly, staying static, reaching out at ranges where most of the drone and artillery threat couldn't touch them. Not charging across minefields, not leading mechanized assaults into fortified positions, finding a spot on the ridge and making Russian armor wish it had stayed home. In this role, it worked. Crews reported engagements at ranges that should have been impossible. The armor held against hits that would have opened up a lighter vehicle like a tin can. At least one engagement produced results that NATO tank instructors are going to be citing for years. Meanwhile, Russia has now lost more tanks to Ukrainian farmers with drones and angle grinders than to anything a British defense contractor ever produced. Which tells you something about this war, and something about British defense contractors. The Kursk incursion, Ukraine's audacious cross-border operation into Russian territory in August 2024, reportedly saw Challenger 2s involved in a more dynamic role. Early reporting from that period suggested additional losses. The Kursk terrain and the speed of the initial operation created exactly the kind of environment the Challenger 2 doesn't excel at. Fast, fluid, logistically chaotic. Some sources in late 2024 placed the combat-ready number as low as 6 or 7 vehicles. But here's the thing about that number. Damaged isn't the same as dead. Ukraine has recovery infrastructure, British advisory teams on the ground, and a political reason to keep every single one of those vehicles running that goes well beyond logistics. The honest bottom line is that it did exactly what it was built to do in the places it was allowed to do it. Everywhere else, the war was simply bigger than the tank, and that gap between what the tank could do and what the war demanded is where the real argument starts. Here's my opinion on this. The debate about whether the Challenger 2 worked in Ukraine has been badly framed from the start, and badly framed in a way that says more about how we think about weapons than about the weapons themselves. 14 tanks was never a military decision. It was a political one. Britain sent enough tanks to signal commitment to encourage allies to provide Ukraine with the capability it genuinely didn't have, and to avoid the domestic political argument of appearing to escalate too aggressively. That's a legitimate foreign policy calculation, but it created an impossible standard for the tank to be evaluated against. If you deploy 14 tanks on a 1,500 kilometer front against a Russian army of 300,000 troops, and then ask whether the Challenger 2 made a difference, you've structured a question designed to produce a disappointing answer regardless of what the tank actually did. It's like sending 14 surgeons to a hospital overwhelmed with 10,000 patients and then questioning whether surgeons are effective at saving lives when the death toll is still high. What the Challenger 2 actually demonstrated in live combat against a real adversary is that Western armor's protection philosophy works. Precision fire at extreme range is real. Crew survivability can be engineered in ways Russian ammunition design physically prevents. Those aren't small things. They're the difference between a tank doctrine that keeps crews alive and one that turns them into ammunition statistics. Russia feared the Challenger 2 would punch through defenses as part of a mass armored breakthrough. That didn't happen because mass armored breakthrough in this war didn't happen for anyone. including Russia, which spent 2 years trying to punch through Ukrainian defenses and mostly succeeded in punching through its own tank inventory. But in the sectors where Challenger 2s were operating, Russia couldn't mass armor without taking precision fire at distances it had no answer for. That's not nothing, it's just not what the headline promised. What this war has actually proven is that no tank wins alone. Not the Challenger 2, not the Leopard 2, not the Abrams. The best armor in the world gets stopped when it doesn't have drones suppressed overhead, mines cleared in front, and infantry holding what it takes. The Challenger 2 learned that the hard way. 14 tanks at a time. 14 tanks walked into a war that has destroyed thousands. Some of them didn't come back. But the crews that operated them came back far more often than this front should have allowed, in an environment that was specifically engineered to kill armored vehicles and was getting better at it every week. The gun hit targets at distances that are going to be cited in military history for a long time. And a British engineering philosophy that the rest of NATO spent 30 years politely mocking worked exactly as designed when it mattered. Russia feared the Challenger 2 would crash through their lines. It didn't. What it actually did was harder to film and harder to explain. For a Russian armored force commander, it was also considerably more unsettling. It sat at the edge of engagement range, made precision kills at distances you thought were safe, and survived the hits that were supposed to stop it. The results were not what anyone expected. They were more complicated, more mixed, and more honest than the hype in either direction suggested. Which, if you've been paying attention to this war, is the only honest answer anyone was ever going to find. If you want more honest analysis on Western weapons in Ukraine, not the propaganda version from Kiev, not the propaganda version from Moscow, but the actual ground-level data, hit subscribe. We're not here to tell you what to feel about this war. We're here to tell you what's actually happening in it.